Good evening. Thanks to each and every one of you being here with us today. We at Jackson Pala are very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar today. I, Amit Saxena, along with my teammate from Medical Services, Dr. Deepika Chabra, Mr. Om Prakash Sharma, Zonal Sales Manager, West Zone, and Mr. S. Kumar, Zonal Sales Manager, South Zone from Nari Division of Jackson Pal, introduce to you ProRetro tablet of dydrogesterone 10 mg. Today's webinar is organized by Clinical Research Committee of FOGSI. This webinar has been granted 3 ICOG points, and we thank ICOG, the office bearers, for organizing this webinars with great stalwarts in the field. Dear attendees, if you have any questions, suggestions, clarifications, please post it in the chat box or Q&A box. Please note this webinar is streaming live on Facebook and the link is already being shared on the chat box for promotion. This webinar recording will remain on Jackson Pearl YouTube channel for future reference. Today's program coordinator is Dr. Anupama Dave, West Zone Coordinator of Clinical Research Committee of FOGSI. She's Professor and Head of Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Medical College, Indore. The conveners are Dr. Akansha Thora, Assistant Professor, Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Medical College, Indore. Dr. Kanchan Prasad, North Zone Coordinator of Clinical Research Committee of FOGSI. She is Associate Professor at Teen Tharkar Mahavir Medical College and Research Center, Moradabad. I now request the conveners to kindly initiate the program.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. And very good evening to everyone. And we start the event with the blessing of our president, Dr. Santa Kumari ma'am, our Secretary General, Madhuri Patel ma'am, and our Vice President, Dr. Basa Mukherjee sir. First, we will be having the video message of Santa Kumari ma'am.
Dear friends, FOGSians and women of my country, I am Dr. Shanta Kumari, President of the Federation of Obstetrics and Gynecological Societies of India. As a little girl, I told myself that I have to become something to make a difference. I always believed that if I desired something wholeheartedly, there is a positive force which makes it happen. And here I am, friends, standing in front of you as the 60th President of FOGSI, the 38,000 strong committed body of OB-GYNs taking care of women's health in our country. As a young girl, I realized that women play a key role in this world, just like Mother Nature or Stree Shakti as we revere it. It is a guiding force behind all forms of God's creation. And it's only a woman who can actually create a new life.
Hi, I'm Kareena Kapoor Khan and I'm so happy to be here with you, if only on video. Pregnancy is a beautiful experience and I have loved having my babies. I congratulate Dr. Shanta Kumari as taking over the 60th president of this eminent organization.
Stree Shakti is the embodiment of 5 elements: the sky, the air, the water, the earth, and the fire. Any imbalance in any of these 5 elements creates chaos and calamities. Similarly, when a woman's health is neglected, it disrupts the universal equilibrium. The intimate link between environment and human well-being is very well known. With increasing awareness of the need for clean water, pollution-free air, and pesticide-free food.
Hi, I'm PV Sindhu. Well, it's such a beautiful feeling for me to be an empowered girl, to be a girl in a nurtured and a safe environment.
Protecting health by preserving nature and its ecosystem is easier than curing any disease. So we have taken up the concept of minimizing the female morbidity and mortality and fetal effects by mitigating the adverse impact of environment. My theme this year goes beyond FOGSI's commitment towards women's healthcare. FOGSI for all, always.
FOGSI for All is another inspiring campaign. What you do in this organization impacts the lives of all of us women in India.
And Dheera to stop violence against women. Foxy for all always will strive to make the girl a Sahasi with Swachhata, Samruddhi and Swasthya. To be Surakshit with Shakti to reach her full potential as a woman.
Dr. Shanta Kumari with the theme Foxy for all always and Dheera Stop Violence Against Women will empower many girls. I firmly believe that only a safe girl, Surakshit Kanya, can grow into a healthy woman, Swasth Mahila.
Violence against women. I think it's a silent pandemic, and I'm so happy to be a part of this campaign.
If any woman has a problem, where does she go to? Not to the police or court or the lawyers. She goes to her friendly OB-GYN, who is her first point of contact for help. So I have started Dheera, an initiative close to my heart, to sensitize our OB-GYNs, the police, the public, and to partner with men to say no to violence against women.
I completely support her vision and mission as President Foxy and also especially support her campaign, Dheera Stop Violence Against Women.
A healthy environment is the core of a woman's health. A healthy woman makes a family happy and a strong nation. I, as the president of Foxy, declare my commitment towards women's health and safety.
Now I would like to invite Dr. Meena Samant ma'am, Chairperson Clinical Research Committee, for the welcome speech.
Namaskar, good evening. A warm and hearty welcome to one and all who've joined here today. My, welcome in absentia to the President Foxy, Dr. Shanta Kumari ma'am, our Secretary General, Dr. Madhuri Patel, VP in charge, Dr. Basab, for their encouragement and always being a source of inspiration for all of us in Foxy. A very warm welcome to the chief guest of today's program, our VP in charge of the West Zone, a very iconic person from Indore, Dr. Kavita Bapat, the ever-smiling, vivacious lady. A very hearty welcome to you, Dr. Kavita ma'am. And today being a program coordinated by the West Zone CRC, ma'am, your presence here means a lot to us. I welcome to all us esteemed speakers for today. The organizing chairperson for the upcoming AICOG, Dr. Asha Bakshi ma'am, also the VP-elect, Foxy. She's a name in herself in infertility. And today she's going to, enlighten us on all the progesterone, how vital it is in the fertility treatment. And hearty welcome to our esteemed chairpersons for today's talk, Dr. Neelam, past President, Patna Obs and Gynae Society from Patna, and Dr. Rekha Wadhwani from Bhopal. Welcome, madam. Welcome to a moderator of a very happening panel discussion for today, ever smiling Dr. Lakshmi Srikhande, an academician par excellence. Welcome, madam, to today's CME. And the expert panelists we have from all across the country, Dr. Priya Bhave from Bhopal, Dr. Manoj Chalani from Chhattisgarh, Dr. Kalpana Singh from Patna, Dr. Neeti Tiwari from New Delhi, Dr. Rekha Rajendra Kumar from Bangalore, and Dr. Jyoti Tripathi from Indore. A hearty welcome to our program director, Dr. West Zone Coordinator, Dr. Anupama Dave, and the two very smart ladies who are convening today's program. The team from also the team from Jackson Pal for coordinating it, doing it always in a very professional manner. And of course all the people, all the audience who logged in today. Thank you and welcome one and all. So I think with that I'll hand over to Dr. Kanchan to introduce formally Dr. Kavita Bapat madam, who's the chief guest for today's program.
It is my pleasure and it is privilege to welcome and introduce the chief guest for today's event, none other than Kavita Bapat ma'am, one of the most energetic and enthusiastic stalwart in Foxy with the charming smile. We all know she's Vice President Foxy 2021-22 and she's organizing Secretary ISOG 2022 Indore. Ma'am, we are just looking forward to it and we are waiting for it. Ma'am is Director of Bapat Hospital and she's renowned vaginal surgeon with master in one-day hysterectomy. Ma'am is a peer reviewer of Jogi and she has initiated registry of primary ovarian insufficiency.
Bas
She's,
Kanchan. Thank you, Kanchan.
Ma'am, you all know, we all are well aware, you are an icon. So you don't need an introduction. Hearty welcome to you, ma'am. And please say a few words to boost our morale.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I thank my close friend, one of the close friends, Meena Samant. I met her, I think, 10 years back. Such a simple and very sweet person. What a great topic today we have chosen. That's an evidence meet experience. There's so many experienced people today as a speakers and a moderators like Dr. Asha Bakshi and Dr. Lakshmi Shrikande as a moderator. Basically, evidence-based practice is a essential of any practice. It involves people to take action by their own context and realities. We ourselves develop experience, we start questioning, we nudging, and we solve the problem. This is basically the sequence which we always feel. And the research evidence ideas and perspectives are basically, we need many clinical trials and they have to be designed and there should be a good execution. And we have to evolve our needs about its economics, about its outcome research. It's about the observational studies, about the registries, about the patient communities are the key point when we talk about the evidence-based practice. But the most important point is experience is a central part of the evidence-based practice. Whatever the practice you do with the evidence base, it's not solely focused, but it's dependent on when all the peer reviewers or anything like that. And the most important point is experience. And you have such a profound speaker today, Dr. Asha Bakshi, who is going to talk on the infertility, and Lakshmi Shrikande, who is going to talk about the crosstalks of the dilemmas of this is such a thing. And great panelists they have, the Priya, Manoj, Neeti, Kalpana, Rekha, and Jyoti. And I just love to see Dr. Neelam and Dr. Rekha Wadhwani over there. It's nice of them. And the best part, my own person, Dr. Anupama Deve, she is working day in and day out to make our scientific program excellent. So I thank you so much, Anupama, involving me over here. You are such a sweet and darling person. And thank you so much for being one of the core committee, a scientific person. And on this today, I get a chance to invite each and everyone to come to Indore physically, not virtually, and not by hybrid. And nice to see Akansha and Kanchan. Such a nice way to see the beautiful girls over there. So thank you so much once again, Meena, for inviting me for the Clinical Research Committee's program. And experience definitely works more over the evidence, and evidence has got its own role. So evidence when needs experience is a really excellent topic for today. Thank you so much for giving me the chance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we start with the first session, the talk, and I would like to.
Kanchan, actually, I had just a couple of slides which I wanted to share, but I forgot during my welcome address. If you allow me, I will just.
Yes, ma'am. Sure, ma'am.
Thank you. So we know because we are, it's the Clinical Research Committee, and it's part of the protocol to introduce something on the research and the study design. So today I will be just briefly touching on the study design, the randomized control trial. As Dr. Kavita Bapat, she mentioned about the evidence-based medicine, and this is the hierarchy when we develop the evidence. Right at the bottom, we have ideas, opinions, editorials, anecdotes. Then comes the case series and case reports. But then when we sort of analyze them, go ahead and look into this population, we have the cross-sectional studies, And on top of that, we have case controls, then cohort, and at the very top, we have the randomized controlled trials. These trials, they answer therapy and diagnosis questions. And today's program, which will be dealing on one of the drugs, that is the progesterone. So I thought I'd just have a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies are considered gold standard epidemiological studies, and well-designed, these studies provide the strongest possible evidence of causation. Clinical trials should be carefully designed, reviewed, and completed, and need to be approved before they can start, and people of all ages can take part in clinical trials. So why use this type of study? I think this is going to be discussed further during the course of our discussions. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we move on to the first session. And I would like to invite the esteemed chairperson for the talk. Our first respected chairperson is Dr. Neelam ma'am. She is a consultant at Santati Fertility Clinic and ART Center. And she's Vice President Patna PAB, Vice President Patna Menopause Society, Joint Secretary Indian Fertility Society Bihar Chapter, and President of Patna Obstetrics and Gynecological Society during 2019 to 20. Chairperson Endometriosis Committee POX during 2017 to 18. Chairperson Scientific Committee IMS East Zone 2017. Chairperson Scientific Committee International Conference on Critical Care in Obstetrics, and she has authored many books including Critical Care in Obstetrics, and ma'am has interest in high risk pregnancy, safe motherhood, and population stabilization. I welcome you, ma'am. Our next chairperson is Dr. Rekha Badwani, and she is presently working as professor and unit head in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at GMC Bhopal. And she has presented various papers in national and state level conference and won CS John Prize twice for best paper at AICOG, Agra and Lucknow. And she has done various research projects and master trainer of EMOC, CAC, and she has delivered guest lectures at various conferences, national and international conferences. And she lectured at National Trainer Workshop at Kathmandu, Nepal in April 2007. And special area of interest is high risk pregnancy. I welcome you, ma'am. And
thank you.
Now I would request Dr. Neelam ma'am to kindly introduce the speaker, the esteemed speaker of our talk, Dr. Asha Bakshi ma'am.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Asha Anil Bakshi. I think everyone knows her. She is such a dynamic person and such a sweet person that we are all looking forward to listen to her. She is lead consultant at Dr. Asha Bakshi Fertility Center in association with Motherhood Hospital, Indore. She is vice president elect in 2022 West Zone, Foxy. She is joint secretary of ISAR 2021. She is founder chairperson of MP IVG and MP ISAR, chairperson of Foxy Infertility Committee in 2017-18, and past president of IOGS, that is Indore Obs and Gynae Society, I think. To her credit goes the first ICSI, TESA ICSI, and micro TC ICSI babies of MP. And she is recipient of Dr. Kumar Tamaskar Award for Foxy in 2008, 2009, and Best Paper in Foxy Journal 2011-12. She has organized many conferences like Star Endogyne Conference in 2019, ICC Con in 2017, ISAR 2016, and Joint Organizing Secretary of IFFS 2016. And she is organizing chairperson 2020-21 AICOG Indore. And we are all looking forward to meet her there, and she's looking forward to have a nice, she is preparing so nicely and so hard, working so hard for it. And without delay, I would request her to start her talk, which is progesterone infertility. What evidence says? Dr. Asha, please, the floor is yours.
And first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Meena Samant for giving me this opportunity, and to Dr. Anupama Dave and to Dr. Kanchan Prasad. And it's so nice to be sharing the same platform with my close friend, Dr. Kavita Bapat today. So it's really nice. And then to see dynamic Lakshmi here. Anyway, we all are going to see Lakshmi, meet Lakshmi during Diwali. So pre-Diwali only we are seeing Lakshmi. Thank you so much. And I'll start my presentation today. So I'm going to talk on progesterone in infertility. What does the evidence say? Treating infertility poses major challenging tasks for gynecologists. Management of luteal phase is a very well accepted fact. I think since ages we are using progesterone like anything, but there isn't much consensus and evidence regarding dose, routes, and duration of progesterone use. And despite of enormous trials, lots of evidence still is required to prevent the indiscriminate use of the progesterone. So progesterone, we all know, is a pro-gestation hormone, and we all, from our knowledge of physiology, know that the production peaks at 44 days after ovulation and continues for a week and falls 2 days before the next menses. And progesterone is further secreted by corpus luteum and restored by HCG stimulation. And gradually, then once the placenta starts forming, there is a shift to placental progesterone. So, and usually the corpus luteum is the main source till 9 weeks of pregnancy, and then comes the placenta. And what are the effects of progesterone? Why it is so important? It is important because it leads to secretory transmission of endometrium. It improves the endometrial receptivity. It promotes uterine musculature quiescence. That is, it relaxes the uterine contractility. It reduces the uterine contractility. It promotes vasodilatation, and it facilitates nitric oxide synthesis in the decidua. So all these things, they really are progestational, and that's why it is known as progesterone. And who require luteal phase support? We are all the time talking about luteal support, but who all require it? And this is where there is confirmed case of luteal phase defect or unexplained infertility, advanced reproductive age, then ART techniques, IUI, IVF, ICSI, hyperprolactinemia, all down-regulated cycles, recurrent pregnancy loss, PCOS, and women with strenuous exercise and underweight. So these are the situations where progesterone may be used. And we know that there are different routes of administration. They may be parenteral. Parenteral may be again intramuscular or subcutaneous, oral, transdermal, and vaginal. So we are going to talk about all these things. And vaginal progesterone has been used for luteal phase defect, and though the levels are low, the progesterone levels, but still the results are good. And the levels are high in the tissue. And progesterone injections, they can be intramuscular injections. I'll be talking about subcutaneous injections also. And they maintain excellent blood levels and sustained blood levels. And they are indicated in luteal phase defect, dysfunction, and miscarriages. And the doses can be either injections that will be 25 to 50 milligram, and vaginal 90 milligram. That is the gel, or 200 milligram, that is the vaginal tablet. Now, 50 milligram intramuscular progesterone is usually given, or subcutaneously is 25 milligram. I think we have discussed about the doses. What are the drawbacks of currently available progesterone therapy? The main problem is variable and unpredictable absorption, variable plasma levels of progesterone, unwanted adverse effects, variable efficacy, and unpredictable results, which may sometimes be associated with unwanted pregnancy loss. So what is the role of luteal phase support in let's start with intrauterine insemination. In intrauterine insemination, you can use any progesterone, vaginal or oral. And in this particular study by Turkish group, they have evaluated vaginal versus oral, and they concluded that both have equal or similar pregnancy outcomes. And only good thing about oral is that it is well tolerated by the patients. Then luteal phase support, is it really again necessary? So let's start with clomiphene-induced cycles when we are doing IUI. So in this particular study, they have shown that clomiphene-induced cycle, vaginal progesterone was not of much help. But this is another study where some authors have reported that there is almost 50% of luteal phase deficiency in clomiphene citrate cycles. And it has competitive, because clomiphene has competitive binding with Eastern E2 receptors. And this leads to reduced sensitivity to endogenous and exogenous steroids. And it is associated with reduced perifollicular vascularization and reduces vascularization of all leading follicles. So in this particular study, they studied progesterone, and especially in relation to various endometrial thickness. And what they found is that the patients who appeared to be best, who had best outcome with progesterone as luteal phase support during clomiphene stimulation cycle were the women who had endometrium 6 to 8 millimeter. So maybe this is the situation where it is helpful. There is no, overall, there is no no evidence that progesterone support is beneficial in clomiphene or IUI cycles, and no significant difference in miscarriage per cycle or live birth rates or clinical pregnancy rates. Then about letrozole cycles. Again, in letrozole cycles, there is not much evidence to evaluate the effect of progesterone luteal support in letrozole cycles. So this particular study does not report whether it is beneficial. Now, in gonadotropin stimulating cycles, stimulated cycles, here the researchers have concluded that progesterone luteal phase support is beneficial to patients undergoing ovulation induction with gonadotropins in IUI cycles. The number needed to treat is 11 patients to have 1 additional live birth. Progesterone support did not benefit patients undergoing ovulation induction with clomiphene citrate or clomiphene plus gonadotropins. So only situation in IUI where it is useful is where you are using gonadotropin stimulated cycles. So the conclusion is that current evidence supports the use of progesterone in patients with gonadotropin stimulated IUI cycles, but not in clomiphene or letrozole cycle. But in day-to-day practice, when most patients have multifollicular development, it may be practical to supplement the luteal phase with progesterone, even in these two groups, that is clomiphene and letrozole. Now, in ART cycles, it was thought that fluid aspiration of follicle diminishes the progesterone producing capacity of corpus luteum. As follicular fluid is removed, the cells that should form the corpus luteum, they are destroyed. Now people are thinking that it is the increased estradiol, the supraphysiological levels, which result in imbalance between estradiol and progesterone ratio. The high levels of estrogens offset the synchrony of endometrium. So the progesterone disrupts the luteal phase due to suppression of pulsatile LH and use of GnRH analog, high levels of estradiol, and triggering with HCG rather than LH. So all these things add further to it. And these are the ASHRAE guidelines regarding progesterone as luteal phase support in IVF and ICSI. And according to these guidelines, a Cochrane meta-analysis reported a high live birth rate, ongoing pregnancy rate with progesterone compared to placebo or no treatment for luteal phase support. So that one thing is for sure that luteal phase support is required in IVF and ICSI. Another thing is which progesterone. So here they've investigated vaginal and rectal compared to the oral route and reported no difference between the groups for live birth, ongoing pregnancy rate. So you can use any route, but support is necessary. So progesterone is recommended for luteal phase support after IVF and ICSI. Any of the previously mentioned routes, non-oral for natural progesterone as luteal phase support can be used. the dosing of natural progesterone has evolved empirically. So still there isn't any proof what dose should be the best, but the usual dosage are 50 milligram daily for intramuscular progesterone, 25 milligram for subcutaneous progesterone, 90 milligram daily for vaginal progesterone gel, and 200 milligram 3 times a day for micronized vaginal progesterone in oil capsules. 100 milligram 2 or 3 times daily for micronized vaginal progesterone in starch suppositories, 400 milligram 2 times daily for vaginal pessary. So starting dose of progesterone, and when should we start the progesterone? So here again, there isn't much consensus, and they've recommended that it can be started between evening of the day of oocyte retrieval and day 3 post oocyte retrieval. I think most of us start on the day of oocyte retrieval, but you can even start within 3 days. Then progesterone for luteal support should be administered until the day of pregnancy test. So this is the recommendation. Beyond this, they have not given any further this thing, though we all tend to, as a traditional, I think we all give up to 10 weeks and 12 weeks, but they have recommended only up to the day of pregnancy test. So basically, the current evidence does not show that there are major differences in efficacy and comparison. So all these things need to be further looked into it. There is one study that says that progesterone supplementation for luteal phase support in fresh IVF cycles is again required. This meta-analysis highlights the need of use of progesterone in fresh IVF cycles. So that I think even guidelines, ASHRAE guidelines have said. And this is another study where they have said that vaginal progesterone supplementation improves pregnancy rates in natural, this is a very important study, because when you do frozen thawed embryo transfer, you may do it in a natural cycle, you may do it in letrozole cycle, or you may do it in HRT cycle. So here in natural cycle, where you have not given anything, here also they have recommended that you should give progesterone support. So luteal phase support is important. Then this is about the subcutaneous injection. This has also been very well accepted. And these are the studies in fresh cycles as well as in frozen embryo cycles, frozen thawed embryo cycles. So here again, comparable implantation rate and clinical pregnancy rate. Subcutaneous, they have recommended subcutaneous progesterone. And nowadays, because there are problems with injectable, it is naturally painful to the patient. Vaginal tablets also, whatever said and done, there is that irritating discharge. And sometimes, somehow our Indian women, they do not tolerate vaginal tablets so well. So I think oral is the best thing that can be used, and that is dydrogesterone. It is being used very often now. It is a stereo isomer of progesterone, and the molecular structure is closely related to that of natural progesterone, but it has enhanced oral availability compared to progesterone and has higher affinity to progesterone receptor with minimal androgenic activity. And it has better patient compliance and effective at low dose with minimal side effects. And this is dydrogesterone versus micronized progesterone in receptor selectivity. So all favorable things are there with dydrogesterone, and that's why it is being preferred. Even the ASHRAE guidelines 2019, they recommend that progesterone is probably recommended for luteal phase support. Now, this is one interesting study which has studied the role of progesterone supplementation in prevention of preeclampsia in high-risk patients. And they found that patients in whom dydrogesterone was supplemented in first and second second trimester, from 6 to 20 weeks of gestation, significant reduction in preeclampsia was found. So this was something interesting I thought I'll put in here. Then another thing is there is insufficient evidence about recurrent pregnancy loss. We are using it so often. So is there any evidence? And basically, if you go through the ASHRAE guidelines, according to them, there is insufficient evidence to recommend the use of progesterone to improve live birth rates in RPL and luteal phase insufficiency, which sounds so odd, because we all use progesterone in such a large quantity, and here they are saying, but when you go through this article in details, then this was something interesting. I found that the effect of vaginal progesterone treatment, 100 to 200 milligram every 12 hours, starting 3 days after the LH surge, was recently evaluated in a cohort of women with RPL and abnormally elevated levels of N-cycline E. And here they found that almost 51% had abnormally elevated levels in luteal phase of N-cycline E, and that resulted in normalization of N-cycline E expression in 84% of the patient. And pregnancy success rate in women with abnormal N-cycline E who were treated with vaginal micronized progesterone starting in the early luteal phase was 69% compared to 51%. But the problem with this study was, as Dr. Meena was saying just now about randomization, this study was not randomized. So maybe there may be some bias. Then there are studies on HCG for improving live birth in women, and they have also been recently summarized in Cochrane Review. So use of progestogen in early pregnancy, this is another study, and here two trials found significantly reduced miscarriage rate in women with history of recurrent pregnancy loss in studies that included patients with at least 3 miscarriages with use of vaginal progesterone. So here they've used vaginal progesterone. So still there isn't much consensus and much evidence, and maybe we are overusing progesterone. So is too much progesterone harmful? So there are only these animal studies, and in this mice studies, they found that there may be decrease in birth weight of excessive progesterone treated mice. Then this is another study where they found that there were some problems with the male fetuses. This is again in the animals, and then some National Registry of Male Births. They have also found that there is probably increase in autism spectrum disorder, and there may be some problems, but still it is not very clear. And some problems have been reported with the use of synthetic progestogens, where hypospadias was found in the male child. So still there is no clarification, and in human beings, overall not much has been reported, but still I think it's very important to have the proper guidance and proper doses so that we do not use progesterone unnecessarily. So basically, luteal phase support is crucial in improving implantation and pregnancy rates. Benefits of clomiphene citrate, benefits on clomiphene citrate, letrozole cycles, and CC letrozole with IUI is not clear. But in gonadotropins, it should be used. There is evidence, and there is a strong evidence for progesterone to be used for ART cycles. Excessive progesterone, we do not know yet what is the effect, and luteal phase support should be used with when indicated and not empirically, as no one fits all solutions. So I would invite you all to AICOG 2022, and please come with all your friends, family, and have a feast of academics and fun. Have fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Asa Bakshi ma'am. And I would request audience to, if they have any question or queries, they can put it in the question answer box. And now I would request Neelam ma'am to give some expert comment.
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank Dr. Meena Samant for giving me this opportunity to chair such a wonderful session. But since it's a meeting of Clinical Research Committee, and by these meetings of Dr. Meena Samant, I have also learned a lot about randomized control trials. So I would just like to put two of the trials regarding progesterone. I would like to share it with you all. First one is Lotus 1 trial, which was a phase 3 randomized control trial, which comparing the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of oral dydrogesterone versus micronized vaginal progesterone for luteal phase support in IVF. And the question was, it was a non-inferiority trial. The question was whether oral dydrogesterone in the dose of 10 milligram 3 times a day, when compared with micronized vaginal progesterone, 200 milligram 3 times a day for luteal support in IVF, which was assessed by the presence of fetal heartbeats and which was determined by transvaginal sonography at 12 weeks of gestation. So whether this oral dydrogesterone was non-inferior to micronized vaginal progesterone. So it was seen that it was a very big trial, and it was randomized control, and it was across 38 centers, and it was conducted from August 2013 to 2016 March. And subjects were more between 18 to 42 years age. BMI was more than 18 to less than 30 kg per meter square, and with a documented history of infertility, planning to undergo IVF. And it was a centrally controlled system was used to randomization, and even the investigators, sponsors, study team, and subjects all were blinded. No one knew who is getting what, whether they are getting micronized progesterone or they are getting oral dydrogesterone. So, and in total, 1,035 subjects were randomized to receive oral dydrogesterone or micronized vaginal progesterone. And the result was that after analysis, it was seen that 497 women in oral dydrogesterone group and 477 women in micronized vaginal progesterone group had embryo transfer. And non-inferiority of oral dydrogesterone was demonstrated with pregnancy rates at 12 weeks of gestation of 37.6% in oral dydrogesterone group and 33.1% in micronized vaginal progesterone treatment group. So there was a difference of 4.7%, and at 95% confidence interval was 1.2 to 10.6%. So live birth rates also were comparable. It was 34.6% in oral dydrogesterone group, whereas in 29.8% in micronized vaginal progesterone group. Again, showing a difference of 4.9% and confidence interval of 0.8 to 10.7%. So it was also seen that oral dydrogesterone was well tolerated and had a similar safety profile to micronized vaginal progesterone. And it was also implied that dydrogesterone may replace micronized vaginal progesterone as standard of care for luteal phase support in IVF because of oral route being preferred by most patients, and it is well tolerated and efficacious treatment. This was Lotus 1 trial in which the dydrogesterone was compared to micronized vaginal progesterone. Then there was Lotus 2 trial, which was also randomized, but it was open label because you can't change. You can always see whether the patient is taking orally or she is taking a gel vaginally. So it was open label and multicentric phase 3 trial, non-inferiority study, which was conducted at 37 IVF centers in 10 countries. And it was from August 2015 to May 2017. And in total, 1,034 premenopausal women, that was more than 18 years to less than 42 years of age, who were undergoing IVF, were randomized at 1:1 basis using an interactive web response system to receive oral dydrogesterone or 8% micronized vaginal progesterone gel, 90 milligram daily, as Dr. Asha Bhakti said. And The question was, but again, it was a non-inferiority trial. So whether oral dydrogesterone 10 milligram 3 times is non-inferior or to micronized vaginal progesterone gel 90 milligram per day for luteal phase support. And the summary answer was that oral dydrogesterone was non-inferior to micronized vaginal progesterone gel for the presence of fetal heartbeat, again, at 12 weeks of gestation. And non-inferiority margin was 10%. And the main result was again that it was oral dydrogesterone was shown with pregnancy rates in full analysis sample at 12 weeks of gestation of 387, 38.7% in oral dydrogesterone group and 35% in micronized vaginal progesterone gel group, with adjusted difference of 3.7% and confidence interval of 95% confidence interval of 2.3 to 9.7. Whereas live birth rates were 34.4% in oral dydrogesterone group and 32.5% in micronized vaginal progesterone gel group. So again, the adjusted difference was 1.9%. So oral dydrogesterone was well tolerated and had a similar safety profile to micronized vaginal progesterone gel again. So in these two trials, Lotus 1 and Lotus 2, that depicts a very big, very big and randomized control one. So it gives more confidence and more faith in oral dydrogesterone group. And as such, it may be a standard of protocol for future ART pregnancies. This was just to add to it. It was a very wonderful talk of Dr. Asha. Learned a lot about all the progesters. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neelam ma'am. And now I request Rika Badwani ma'am to share her expertise and experience.
Thank you, Asha ma'am, for a precise and excellent talk on progesterone, pregnancy hormone. जैसा कि अपन हमेशा से बोलते आए हैं. As we all know, it is a team leader for implantation, and it also has immunomodulator effect. Madam, you have nicely described all the doses, routes, side effects, when to start, what the evidence says. It was really a very nice talk. You have nicely explained the take-home messages from the different trials and studies, and rightly said that dihydrogesterone is equally effective or somewhat more effective than micronized progesterone. Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rekha ma'am. Now I think we have one small video running. Then we will move on to next question.
Jagsonpal Pharmaceuticals Limited proudly presents Pro-Retro Micronized Dydrogesterone Tablet 10 mg. Jagsonpal Pharmaceuticals is manufacturing all the active pharmaceutical ingredients and intermediates concerning dydrogesterone, making India self-reliant. Atmanirbhar Bharat. Vocal for local. Go for Pro-Retro.
So, good evening, doctor, from RA division of Jagsonpal. I am Ram Kumar, zonal sales manager heading South India, South Zone, and we look forward your support for Pro-Retro, doctor. With this webinar, we have the pleasure to share with you the development which Jagsonpal has made in the recent times with the active pharmaceutical ingredient of dydrogesterone used in Pro-Retro 10 mg tablets. After years of indigenous research and development, Jagsonpal is proud to have made in India self-reliant for the critical API of dydrogesterone, remarkably reducing the cost to the patient, doctor. Me and my colleagues seek your support for Pro-Retro micronized dydrogesterone 10 mg tablets, assisting motherhood, delivering happiness. Thank you, doctors.
Thank you so much. Moving ahead to our next segment, we have a panel discussion that is a cross-talks on dilemmas in the management of fertility. Aching hearts, empty arms, and broken, spinning in circle for eternity. We are waiting and we are patient. Oh dear fertility, oh dear fertility. I take extreme pleasure to introduce and welcome our moderator for the crosstalks, Dr. Lakshmi Srikhande, madam. She's chairperson-elect ICOG, Indian College of Obs and Gynae, National Corresponding Editor, Journal Jogi, National Corresponding Secretary, Association for Medical Women India, Founder Patron, President, ISOPAR Vidarbha Chapter, IMS Education Committee Chairperson 21 to 23, President for Association of Medical Women Nagpur, received many awards to her credit, including Nagpur Ratna Award, Bharat Excellence Award, Mehru Dara Hansotia Best Committee Award, received appreciation from Maharashtra government as she's worked in the field of saving the girl child, Senior Vice President Foxy 2012, President Menopause Society Nagpur 2016-18, 200506, delivered many orations and guest lectures, and has publications in 30 national and 11 international journals. We welcome you, ma'am, on board. I would also like to welcome our esteemed panelists, Dr. Priya Bhave, ma'am. She's a fellow in reproductive medicine from CMC Vellore 2008 to 10. Foxy recognized training she gives in basic and advanced infertility management. First doctor in MP to hold a subspecialty qualification in reproductive medicine. First professor of reproductive medicine in the whole of North India, started the first DM course in the same. Best paper award in role of GnRH antagonists in ISAR 2010, and hysteroscopic management of adenomyotic myometrial cysts. She's an author of Cochrane Review for Menstrual Disorders in Subfertility Group, and she started FNB in 2018. That is the first in Central India. We welcome you, ma'am. Let me get the chance to introduce Dr. Manoj Chilani, who's past President, Raipur Obs Gynae Society, Chairperson CG ISAR Elect 22-24, President, Raipur Menopause Society, Founder Secretary of the Vaginal Surgeries, Founder Secretary IFS Chhattisgarh Chapter, and past Vice President IMA Raipur. We extend a hearty welcome, sir.
Thank you.
We would like to welcome Dr. Neeti Tiwari, consultant at the Center of IVF at Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi, a joint secretary, AOGD, that's Delhi 2020, co-convener for SIG Endometriosis 2022. Hearty welcome again, ma'am. Dr. Kalpana Singh, founder, joint secretary, Indian Fertility Society, Bihar Chapter, treasurer, IFS Bihar Chapter, co-chairperson, Endoscopic Committee, POGS, more than 25 publications to her credit, recipient of Bharat Ratna Radhakrishnan Gold Medal Award, and a Best Paper Gold Medal Award in Embryology section in GFM COCon 2018. Very warm welcome to our webinar today, madam. Next, we would like to welcome Dr. Rekha Rajendra Kumar. She's a practicing gynecologist for the past 30 years, BSOG 2021 Honorary Secretary, South Zone Coordinator, Foxy Infertility Committee, a peer reviewer of Jogi, National and International Online Master Trainer in Fertility to postgraduate students, speaker, chairperson, moderator in more than 400 national and international conferences. A very warm and hearty welcome to our webinar, ma'am. And lastly, I would like to invite our very own Dr. Jyoti Tripathi, ma'am. She's a fellow in fertility and gynec endoscopy, currently working as a consultant in Nova IVF Indore, formerly at Indra IVF Indore, a former consultant at Santati Infertility Center in Indore, former consultant at GK Hospital, trained at Wadia Hospital. She has special interest in reproductive genetics, hysteroscopy, and gynec ultrasound. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Let us now begin with a beautiful crosstalk discussion on fertility. I hand over the stage to Dr. Lakshmi, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Akansha, for introducing me and all the esteemed experts. Friends, we all face dilemmas day in and day out. But in this panel, I have tried along with my esteemed experts to cover the 6 dilemmas which are very common in our infertility practice. So let us start with the first case, that is whether we should do tubal testing before IUI or not. So Dr. Neeti, this case is for you. She's 32-year-old, married for 2 years, came to you with history of irregular cycles. I know we all do our own transvaginal ultrasound. On TVS, you find the features of PCOS, and you have ordered AMH, which comes to 6.2 nanogram per ml. Male factor is normal. You did IUI-H for 3 cycles, there was no success. Then you advised HSG, and the report was 1 tube block, 1 patent. patient is Google savvy. She has read a lot. So as is the theme of this webinar, that is evidence meets experience. So I would like you to elaborate both evidence and your experience in counseling this patient and how will you go about it. Dr. Neeti.
Thank you so much, ma'am. First of
I
all,
will
I would
stop,
like
yeah.
to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. We all know what are the prerequisites for intrauterine insemination, that there should be ovulation either in a natural cycle or reduced. The inseminate should have adequate number of motile sperms, and we use our own cutoffs because there is no defined cutoff, and absence of active cervical, intrauterine or pelvic infection, and patency of at least one fallopian tube. So there is no controversy on these, that these are the prerequisites for intrauterine insemination. But does that mean that tubal evaluation is a must in all the patient before IUI? And if yes, what tests should be done for tubal patency? So first I will be answering the first question, that what tests should be done for tubal patency. Hysterosalpingography, we have been doing it for ages. It is a traditional method for screening tubal patency, and it may offer therapeutic benefit also. We all know from our clinical practice that patients conceive in the same cycle when we do the HSG and sometime in the following cycles. And it can beautifully document proximal versus distal occlusion. You know where the tube is blocked. It can show salpingitis asthmatica nodosa. It may suggest tubal phimosis or peritubal adhesions by delayed or localized pills. So many a times we can, even know the pathology by looking at an HSG film, and it gives an extra information about the intrauterine pathologies also, and congenital malformation of the uterus can also be made out on HSG. But the problem is that there is a positive predictive value of only 38%, and a negative predictive value is good of 94%. What does that mean? That it has a very high false positive rate. So whenever a HSG is normal, we are relaxed. But if HSG is abnormal, can we say that there is a problem? No, we have to go for a laparoscopy because the false positive rate of HSG is very high, especially if it is a proximal tubal occlusion. Then the pitfalls are that it requires dilatation of cervix, and hence it can cause discomfort. We know of women undergoing vasovagal, this shock also because of pain sometimes, and there is a risk of radiation exposure. So what is the alternative? The study which came in, the study which came in 2011, the group consists of Dr. Shiladit Bhattacharya also. They compared HSG with HyCoSy, which is hysterosalpingo contrast sonography. And they found that HyCoSy has same diagnostic accuracy as HSG without exposing women to radiation. And while doing ultrasound, you can see other features on ultrasound also. So this made a very strong comment. They said that HSG is out of date. It has no place in a modern infertility evaluation. And, they said that HyCoSy should be the way forward. And see what has come in September 2021. Now, HyFoSy, which is hysterosalpingo foam sonography. This is a new thing which has come up where they say it is a less painful technique. It is as good as HSG, and it should be the first choice diagnostic option when we are going for the, tubal testing for the first time. So definitely these tests, it seems they are pushing for, backwards the HSG, but we know a lot of us are still doing hysterosalpingography, and we get a, film which when we are doing it under control, we are getting a very good film, and a lot of diagnosis can be made on that also. So, it is our choice ultimately. If we are comfortable, we are expert in HyCoSy. HyCoSy could be the way forward, but if we are doing HSG, that is also good enough. But how do we go about doing a tubal testing to begin with? When we see a patient, infertile women, on history and ultrasound evaluation only we can find out how we go about it. So if there is a suspicion of fibroid, endometriosis, hydrosalpinx, or bilateral tubo-ovarian masses, we know that, in this case, laparoscopy is the first thing. In laparoscopy, we will do see and treat approach. We will see and treat whatever pathology is there. And at the same time, tubal evaluation will also be done. But suppose everything is normal, then what? Then the next step is going for hycosi or HSG. In Western world, they are giving a lot of importance to chlamydia antibody titer, which we are not giving. But in our setup, maybe, history suggestive or examination suggestive of tuberculosis. Genital tuberculosis becomes important before we go for a first, test for tubal pathology. Now, coming to the question that this lady who is a PCOS, who has a normal semen parameters, and we have done her IUIs without doing HSG. How can we justify ourselves? So I, go back to the recent guidelines, ESHRE ASRM 2018. This is international evidence-based guidelines for the assessment and management of polycystic ovarian syndrome, and see what it says. It very clearly says that in women with PCOS and infertility due to anovulation alone, with normal semen analysis, the risk, benefit, cost, and timing of tubal patency should be discussed on individual basis. Of course, when there is a suspected tubal infertility, you will definitely go for semen analysis before going ahead with treatment. But if there is no suspicion of tubal infertility, so where do we get a suspicion of tubal infertility? We get when there is a previous abdominal or pelvic sepsis, where there is previous pelvic or abdominal surgery, case of recurrent acute pelvic pain, history of sexual transmitted disease or pelvic inflammatory disease, or endometriosis. These are the patients in which there is no doubt we have to do a tubal patency, think about doing tubal patency. Otherwise, we can delay tubal testing in these women. But what is important is, as Dr. Lakshmi said in the beginning, what is important is counseling. It is counseling. See, when we take up these patients for IUI, that patients are Google savvy now, and every article about IUI, and if they open up the net, the first thing they say is tubal testing should be done. Tubal testing should be done. So if you are planning to do IUI without going for tubal testing, please discuss it with them that in your case, you are a pure PCOS, you are basically anovulatory. Actually, in PCOS to begin with, IUI is not even required. What we need to do is only ovulation induction and timed intercourse. But suppose after 2 or 3 cycles of that, patient is not conceiving and we are thinking of going for IUI, you can tell them that, I'm not suspecting a tubal factor in you because your ultrasound is absolutely normal. You have no discharge. The uterine mobility is very good. Everything looks, well in place. And I can do 1 or 2 IUIs without doing HSG. Or if you want, we can go for tubal patency straight away. We can give that option to them, but we are not wrong actually in delaying tubal patency in her. So to ponder for us is that yes, tubal testing is considered as one of the initial investigations in workup of infertile women, but it may be delayed in young patients with good ovarian reserve, short period of infertility, normal ultrasound pelvis, and no history suggestive of present or past pelvic infection under following circumstances. For example, PCOS with normal semen parameters like this patient, or when we are going for donor insemination, we can easily do 2 cycles of IUI without doing tubal testing if everything is like what I said above, or non-consummation due to sexual dysfunction, vaginismus or erectile dysfunction. In these women also with normal semen parameters, we can do 2 cycles of IUI without doing tubal testing. So this is my submission for this patient.
Excellent. Niti, you have very well pointed out that ESHRE guidelines, you can explain to the patient that in your case, I followed the ESHRE guidelines and that is why you have not done HSG. Because all the guidelines, they are always not in sync. Some says you have to do before starting IUI, but ESHRE 2018 gives you guidelines when to do, when not to do before starting IUI. So coming back to this case, now after 3 IUI-H, you have seen 1 tube is blocked and she is 32 years old and a case of PCOS. So will you go for laparoscopy or how will you go ahead? How will you counsel her?
Ma'am, actually this patient, if you look at her, she's not that young. She's 32-year-old already. 32, and she has an infertility of 6 years, though it is anovulatory. If I assume that we have tried ovulation induction in past before going for IUI also, so maybe she has got 6-7 cycles of ovulation induction already. If there is 1 tube is blocked, I think I would go for a laparoscopy and try to see, because there could be, even if the tube which is open, if 1 tube is blocked, first of all, we might find that that tube is open also. It might be a false positive, thing. But if it is actually blocked, then there might be some pathology on the other side also. Even if it is coming as open on HSG, there might be some pathology there sitting there. So
yeah, I invite other panelists to pitch in. Anybody has got any different suggestion or ideas on this case? Priya, you want to say something?
I agree with Dr. Neeti, because as she mentioned, we practice in an area which is tuberculosis endemic.
Yes.
Whenever we find anything, even small abnormality in HSG, we have a low threshold for lap and dye, mainly because we can look at the peritoneal factors, endometriosis as well as tuberculosis in these patients.
Yes, because semen analysis is normal, male factor is normal. So the rational approach is to go for hysterolaparoscopy. And if you can make the tubes patent, she has got all the chances of conceiving on her own or with your help of ovulation induction. So any other panelist wants to add on this case, or should I go on the second case? So I think we are very clear about the first case dilemma, whether we should do tubal factor before start of IUI or not, when to do, what to do. Now let us come to another dilemma in our day-to-day practice, that is endometriosis, whether to do surgery or not to do surgery. So Dr. Rekha, she is 37-year-old, married for 3 years. She is a case of primary subfertility. Male factor is normal, but AMH is 1.1 nanogram per ml. She has come to you with ultrasound report of right ovary showing 4.5 centimeter endometriotic cyst. The AFC right side, they could not measure the antral follicular count, but on left side it is 4. You have advised IVF by self-egg without doing endometriosis surgery, but patient is worried about the cyst. So this is the dilemma, whether to do surgery, then go for IVF, or go for IVF without operating on her. So your say on this dilemma.
Madam, thank you so much for the
Excellent.
opportunity. Yeah, the topic of dilemma today that is given to me is, in summary, about the woman who has a poor ovarian reserve with endometriosis of 4.5 centimeter. How should I counsel her regarding the infertility treatment without operating on her? First, let me put all the guidelines on place, and then later give my opinion on this case. Now the first slide says that these are the guidelines which say don't operate on such a woman. So what does that say? Due to the removal of a healthy ovarian tissue, though that is an endometrioma, ovarian endometrioma, the surrounding ovarian tissue is fortunately healthy. And so especially in the ovarian cystectomy, when we do, compared to the drainage or ablation, because the cystectomy is the most popular one, because there is presence of healthy ovarian tissue, as well as in the cyst there are so many follicles that are seen, and there is also added vascular injury, especially when we operate near the ovarian hilum. The surgical removal of the endometriosis can prove to be damaging to the ovaries. It's from pan to the fire kind of situation. So this finally results in the reduced ovarian reserve, and also according to different studies, after removal of endometrioma, there has been a reduced response of the ovaries to the gonadotrophins. We wanted a better thing to happen, but unfortunately it's not the bright scene there. So that is according to the Donese, who is given many studies regarding the endometrioma. Although endometriomas per se could be detrimental to the ovarian reserve, the current evidence indicates that an even lower ovarian reserve observed after the surgery, like the AMH 1.1 in this case, may fall further after the surgery. The quality of the oocytes retrieved in IVF cycle is not improved after the surgery. We think that was contained endometriotic fluid. We have removed that, and so further the oocytes are going. We are going to get a quality oocytes. The follicles are going to expand, but that is not so in certain cases. Patients undergoing an operative procedure might extend the time to pregnancy because they think recently I have undergone surgery, so let me not try for pregnancy, and they may differ for few more months.
In specific circumstances, according to GDG group, in specific circumstances such as pelvic pain or difficult to access the growing follicles during our egg pickup, then only surgery should be performed, but it should not be offered to every single woman where we see the endometrioma, that is endometrioma associated infertility. So these are the guidelines which said do not operate. So the next slide says that better operate, and what do they say and how do they substantiate their fact? It says in Cochrane 2008, in ovarian endometrioma with a diameter equal to or more than 4 centimeter, this woman is 4.5 centimeter endometrioma. So they say laparoscopic cyst excision leads to improvement in the access to the follicles during our egg pickup, and it might possibly improve the ovarian response also, but the woman should be counseled. This is very, very important. Should be counseled regarding the risk of the reduced ovarian function after the surgery. Regarding operating, I have put the source then and there itself. The regarding operating a cyst beyond 4 centimeter, surgeon should keep in his mind that if all the healthy growing follicles may be reached and oocyte collection is not hindered without touching the endometrioma, then there is no requirement of surgery for the cyst of 3 to 4 centimeter or even up to 5 centimeter in asymptomatic patients. However, but if the growing follicles get obscured by this endometrioma, so we are not able to reach those follicles, especially if the ovary is fixed, which may happen in many cases because of peri-ovarian adhesions, then such cases may need intervention. In such cases, they say excision is better than ablation. We will not go into the detail of why excision is better than ablation. All of us know about that. However, in women undergoing IVF, when the excision becomes difficult, maybe because of the poor surgical plane between the cyst wall and the surrounding ovarian tissue, like when we operate the traction and counter traction, what we use in excision, suppose that becomes difficult to get the plane there, then maybe a simpler one like incision drainage and selective ablation of the bed may be considered, but the first choice would be the excision when you think of operating. Though chances of endometrioma recurrence is more with ablation because you have not tackled the bed of that endometrioma. Rather, the purpose of the reproductive surgery comes first to the forefront for me to think about, because that is my mission in this woman, than think of endometrioma recurrence. According to American Society of Reproductive Medicine 2012, those guidelines say that the age of the female, what are the factors we should consider when we subject her to operation, or why we defer operation. So the factors that I have to consider while I make my decision would be the age of the woman, the duration of infertility, here she is married for 3 years, stage of endometriosis, and presence of associated symptoms like severe dyspareunia, etc. should be considered while formulating a management plan. For women who are relatively elderly, that is more than 35, intense infertility management such as IUI or IVF, probably in early stages like 1 and 2, you push her to IUI, or say 3 or 4, it is IVF, should be considered. In women with advanced stage of endometriosis associated infertility, conservative surgical therapy with laparoscopy will prove beneficial. If they fail to conceive following a conservative surgery, we have done the surgery, and in spite of if they fail to conceive, or of the advanced reproductive age, if the woman is reproductive age more even soon after the surgery, then we should push her to IVF as early as possible. Resection or ablation rather than drainage should be considered as the surgical management, and resection is the preferred one according to ASRM. Now, ACOG says due to the removal of endometriomas, due removal of the endometriomas carries a risk that normal tissue will also be removed, especially when you are not sure of the plane or when you are cauterizing the tissue. Simple drainage of the endometrioma is associated with a high recurrence rate, as all of us know. Therefore, excision is recommended according to ACOG 2011. Reoperation in women with recurrent endometriomas should be considered on a case-by-case basis, like the advanced age of the woman, advanced married life, that's for long
period or AMH is low, etc., should be considered because it may result in reduced or total loss of ovarian function. ASRM says there is no difference in the implantation rate, pregnancy, or the miscarriage rate if large endometriomas are excised compared to the study with the other arm saying no excision. So it says everything is same. According to RCOG 2006 working group of ISGE and ISHRE, large endometriomas which are more than 4 centimeter with a long-standing infertility, laparoscopic cystectomy is the first line of choice. Immediately, the patient should be put on GnRH agonist for 3 to 6 months. That is a long duration of the GnRH agonist, and then taken for IVF ICSI, and this has proved very, very successful according to these big bodies. The presence of endometrioma less than 6 centimeter at the time of stimulation has no impact on the quality of the embryos and the final results of the IVF, despite the possible decrease in the number of oocytes retrieved. So their surgical treatment before IVF is not recommended just to improve the fertility. So just leave them as they are according to HAS guidelines. The ISHRE guidelines say that in women with ovarian endometrioma who are receiving surgery for infertility or pain, excision of the endometrioma capsule increases the spontaneous post-operative pregnancy rate when compared with drainage and electrocoagulation of the endometrioma wall. I may be repeating these certain facts, but each guideline I have to reiterate so they come again and again. The decision to proceed with the surgery should be considered carefully if the woman has had previous ovarian surgery. So again, we have to counsel and make a decision there. In women with moderate to severe endometriosis, there are no controlled studies comparing reproductive outcome after the surgery, and the other arm would be the expectant management. 2 high-quality prospective cohort studies were conducted, and they showed like the crude spontaneous pregnancy rate of around 60% in moderate endometriosis, and it's around 50 to 60% in severe endometriosis after the laparoscopic surgery in one arm, and the other arm is this is much higher in the laparoscopy compared to the other arm where it was an expectant management, and the pregnancy rate was almost half of that in both moderate and severe endometriosis. It is like 0% in severe endometriosis when it was an expectant management. So the difference is huge. A retrospective study on the impact of the large ovarian endometriomas on the response to superovulation for IVF says endometriomas which are more than 5 centimeter at the time of IVF significantly decreases the responsiveness to superovulation. Thank you. This is about the guidelines I explained. Now coming to this woman, if I have to give my judgment or if I have to give my statement, I would take out and pick certain facts here which where the bell should ring in our mind, saying that she's 37-year-old and she's married already for 3 years, probably never used any kind of contraception, and AMH is 1.1. that is I can say little on the lower side. The ovarian endometriotic cyst is also not too small, around 4.5 centimeter. What I want to say is that is occupied a big chunk of the ovary, and to top it all, her left ovary shows very less number of follicles there. The AFC on day 2 itself is only 4. So with all that, I will definitely advise her to go for the without surgery. I'll advise her to go for the initialization of the IVF treatment after a dose of GnRH analog, and then go for the direct IVF without surgery. And I will tell her the substantiate my facts with the statements which I have mentioned with different kinds of guidelines which went for not operating because as Lakshmi madam said, there are definitely different kinds of guidelines which are one opposite to another, and I should not confuse her with all her facts. But she's, as you said, Google savvy, read all the notes on Google and has made her own opinion. Then I will explain all the pros and and cons about the guidelines. Also, I will tell her that your AMH is already 1.1, which may fall further after the surgery. So we have to check your AMH even after the surgery. If she insists so much, in spite of my counseling, this is what I stand here.
Thank you so much, Rekha, because as you all can see, all the guidelines, they are again not in sync with each other. Some has taken 4 centimeter as cutoff, some guidelines 5, some has taken 6. And then there are n number of controversies. So again, coming back to the theme, evidence meets experience. Now, in her experience, Dr. Rekha has said she will advise IVF without surgery. Does anyone differ? Priya? Because I agree with you, Rekha. I will not advise her surgery. She's 37, AMH 1.1. I just want, Priya, your take on what Dr. Rekha said about giving agonist, because I use fixed antagonist protocol for self-egg. So should we give agonist before starting stimulation or directly go with the stimulation? But this is again a dilemma which she has posed. I mean, Dr. Rekha, to give agonist or not to give? Yeah.
Right. Till a few years ago, all of us were thinking that it is a dictum that if it is endometriosis, we have to use a long agonist protocol. But now there is enough evidence to suggest that any protocol is okay. So we can use antagonist or agonist. It is a matter of personal preference. Regarding this case, I would like to underline that if the patient has pain, then I think many of us would think in terms of surgery. Also, because whenever we do IVF or when we are planning for a frozen cycle and we give estrogen to these patients, then the pain might worsen. So in case there is a pain component, then our decision might be a little more in favor of surgery rather than direct IVF.
Yeah, and if she is asymptomatic, then we are fully justified in going ahead with IVF without doing any surgery. So anyone wants to say anything on this case? Yeah.
Yeah, just to interrupt,
Yeah.
what I meant was it is give 1 dose, that's a 1 month dose of GnRH agonist, the Leupride or whatever you call.
We don't give. If I am using, like I use antagonist protocol, then I will not give her a single dose of agonist. I will put her on OC pills down regulation and I will take her according to my cycle stimulation for antagonist protocol.
Ma'am, I want to say one thing here. That if we give depot, which Dr. Rekha is talking about, we should remember that the reserve is already less, and it can further, lessen the reserve and the response. So if we are, in habit of giving, so that is what has come up now, that initially it was thought that the prolonged down regulation is a very good protocol, giving 2 to 3, months of depot, but we found that it reduces the response, ovarian response. So another, view is now that you do the antagonist cycle by some pre-treatment if you want for a good cohort, and take out the eggs, freeze the embryos if possible, and then do a prolonged down regulation and do a transfer. So before doing a transfer, this is a segmental approach, which then has come up now, that before transfer, if you give depots, it may improve the implantation, which could be problem in endometriosis.
Very well said, Neeti. Anyone wants to share another, different ideas apart from what has been already covered by Dr. Rekha, or should we move ahead to the third dilemma? So if asymptomatic 4.5, you are justified in going ahead with IVF without surgery. But if symptomatic, as Dr. Priya has said, you are justified in first operating surgery and then going for IVF. During surgery, again, there are a lot of controversies, whether you should do only drainage, cystectomy. You have to basically counsel your patient, and it has to be a shared decision making with written informed consent that what you are going to do. Because if you are doing cystectomy, it is understood that she will have again decreased ovarian reserve. So if you are only draining and then taking her for IVF, discuss everything with the patient. Patients, they do understand everything, and then with shared decision making, you go ahead. So now,
something or more I want to say here, ma'am, sudden increase in size of cyst, and if you see any contents like papillary excrescences or even in a 4.5 centimeter cyst, we should be very sure that you are leaving a endometriotic cyst behind. If there are any nodules or papillary excrescences on this cyst, any doubt in the diagnosis or malignant transformation, we have to think of surgery.
Yeah,
That's why evidence needs experience, because you just can't practice only based on the evidence or based only on the guidelines.
Exactly.
Here comes your experience based on the guidelines, and
Yeah.
every treatment has to be individualized for that particular woman and for that particular couple. So now let us go to the third dilemma, because now we know that endometriosis is really never ending dilemmas. Now let us go to the case 3. This is again a great dilemma: submucous fibroids or intramural fibroids, whether to remove or not to remove. Dr. Manoj, she is a 26-year-old. She has come to you with one spontaneous abortion at 8 weeks. This was 6 months back. Now she has come to you for preconception counseling. You have done TVS and you have found out fibroid 2.5 centimeter, which just touches the endometrium, but it is 100% intramural. You have advised to go ahead with pregnancy without surgery, but patient is worried about fibroids.
Yeah.
So I have quoted this situation. In fibroid, this is the 3, contact endometrium, but 100% intramural. So now your take on this case scenario.
Ma'am, there are clear-cut guidelines regarding the fibroids. In this case, there is no confusion. But the problem is she has already undergone one miscarriage. So it's very important that we counsel her. We try to understand from her point of view. Thing is, there are two things, main criteria as far as fibroid is concerned. And one is the size of the fibroid, and secondly is the distance of fibroid from the endometrium, or if the fibroid is distorting the uterine cavity. You know, the research has found out that they did the endometrial sampling, and they did the testing. They divided into 3 criteria. The endometrium, which was nearer to the fibroid, which was touching the endometrium, less than 1 millimeter. The other group was 1 to 3 millimeter, and third group was more than 3 millimeter. So they found that HEXA 11 and 10 genes were less in cases when the endometrium was touching or just less than 1 millimeter. So that is very, very important. If the fibroid is more than 3 millimeters, there's no need to worry. And secondly, the size of the fibroid is also very important. So if it's more than 4.5, then one can think of surgery. So in this case, the size of the fibroid is around 2.5 and it's just touching the endometrium. And there was no problem with the implantation. Only problem was she couldn't carry the pregnancy. So proper counseling and reassurance is very important. And I think there's no need of surgery in this case. So there are various studies have been done, and it has been found that it won't affect the implantation rate, and if the fibroid is not distorting the uterine cavity, it's away from the uterine cavity. Then, and one thing is important that we should redo the scan, do a proper good 3D scan, because sometimes we do make mistakes when we take the patient the OT. On USG it was showing 2.5 or something, and then we found that it's around 4 centimeters or so. So it's very important that proper ultrasound should be done, 3D ultrasound should be done, and we just reassure the patient and go ahead.
Yeah, your take on this. Now, Manoj, you only, because you have quoted evidence, but now what your experience is, whether you will put in cystoscope or you will not put. Just 2.5 centimeter touching the endometrium. So will you go ahead with the surgery or not? What is your experience?
Ma'am, yeah, I've somehow I operated many fibroids, and luckily post mammectomy they have conceived. So because there was no such evidence, I don't have that evidence to prove
your
that
experience,
the fibroid is away from the endometrium, still they are conceiving. So they do conceive, but in this case, I will not operate, to be very honest.
Yes, I agree with you. Even I will not operate. Priya, your take, and then every other panelist can pitch in if they differ from Manoj. Manoj, you can stop your screen share.
Yeah.
I agree with sir, because the problem is that if it is a totally intramural fibroid, localization of the fibroid will be difficult in surgery, and they will actually end up damaging more myometrium when we are digging for the fibroid. But then, of course,
can convince and counsel her that this fibroid is not responsible for her miscarriage. So again, counseling will play a great role. Anyone wants to differ here? Or should we go to the fourth dilemma? Now you must be realizing that our practice is full of dilemmas and dilemmas. So now let us go to the fourth dilemma, which is in cases of unexplained infertility. Priya, this is for you. She is 42-year-old. She is trying to conceive since last 6 years. AMH is 1.5. Male factor is normal. She has undergone 6 cycles of IUI-H with oral ovulations. Now she is come to you for opinion, and you have advised directly IVF without taking her through the gonadotropin cycle. She is not convinced. So how will you counsel her? Evidence versus experience.
So in this situation, there are two issues. One is, of course, the age, because this the moment that we see age of 42 as infertility specialist, all of us start thinking deeply about it. The second thing is that she's already had 6 cycles of IUI. And recently in unexplained infertility, we are expecting the HRA guideline, I think this year or by next year it will come. But the ASRM guideline, which came in last year, the ASRM guideline said clearly that in patients who are not kind of conceiving with oral ovulation and IUI, it is better to skip gonadotropin IUI, because in this guideline, what they have seen is not only the pregnancy rate, but also multiple pregnancy rates. So what they found is that the multiple pregnancy rate is unacceptably high with gonadotropin IUI, and the pregnancy rate is not that great. So they recommend going directly to IVF after failed cycles of IUI with clomiphene or letrozole. Now, important thing is that in this patient, this again is brought out by this trial. It is an old trial, almost 11 years ago, by Dr. Richard Raindollar, a very famous trial, wherein they say the fast track versus the standard treatment, the fast trial. Now, in the fast trial, they were younger women. They were between 21 to 39 years old. And they found that an increased rate of pregnancy in the accelerated arm. So where the couples were directly pushed for IVF rather than undergoing IUI cycles, they found a better pregnancy rate. And the time to pregnancy, that is basically our aim mostly as fertility specialists, because all of our patients will usually conceive, but we want them to reach there faster. So median time to pregnancy was shorter in the accelerated arm, and actually the cost per delivery was lower in the accelerated arm compared to the conventional arm. The important thing is that they've not only looked at the charges, but also the cost, that is the loss of work, the amount of visits per clinic, the number of ultrasounds. So if you take all of that into account, actually to go for IVF is also cost effective and faster. Now our patient is an older lady, she's 42. So the same group had another good trial called FORT, the 40 and over treatment trial. And what they saw is that women who were older, 38 to 42 years old, they randomized to either receive clomiphene IUI or FSH IUI or immediate IVF. And the 3 groups were 52 and 51 patients in each arm respectively. And what they found was also that the IVF pregnancy rates were much higher, 49% pregnancy rates compared to 21 and 17. And in fact, most of the live births in this trial were from the couples who underwent IVF. Another data from Europe and Australia by Sarah Armstrong, in women over 40, this is a very sobering data, because in women over 40, the IUI with FSH also is only 3% pregnancy rate, and live birth rate is just 1%. So I think this should be enough to demotivate any patient. A 99% failure rate is almost like a 100% failure rate. So I think this patient should have gone for IVF much earlier, but as they say, better late than never. I would advise her for IVF, quoting this data.
Yeah, Priya, you can stop screen sharing. I know there is no dilemma if she agrees for IVF, but there is one category where patient doesn't agree or where they can't afford IVF. So then what next? In this case scenario only. I mean, she's just not convinced, that she's saying she can't afford.
See, the problem is that, most of the women as they age, they feel actually better about themselves. They can't believe that their ovaries are aging. So unfortunately, aging is aging. So, and I think it is unethical for us to not tell them this dismal pregnancy rates and still do an IUI for her at a pregnancy rate of 1%. And maybe if the patient is still not convinced, maybe try one cycle and then show her the results. What works in my unit is we show them our own results of IUI and IVF. And
But
that
if
usually,
you try gonadotropin cycle, if she just not willing for IVF, will you give her a trial of gonadotropin cycle and IUI before proceeding to IVF, like 1 or 2 cycles?
she's already had 6 cycles of IUI. So personally, I would not.
You will put your foot down कि she needs IVF. Any other wants to agree or put your, you want to put forth your points? Yes, Niti?
Ma'am, I think if I agree with Dr. Priya, this woman should have been taken up for IVF way back, maybe 2-3 years back. The only good thing about her is that she still has a good reserve.
Yeah,
what we encounter in our population, I don't know about your in North India, after 40, the reserve is very low, ma'am. So even in IVF, the results are not very great.
Even quality goes down.
Yeah, the
Not
quality
only
goes
go
down.
yeah.
And suppose a woman, even after gonadotropin, good dose, whatever you think is the best for her, makes 1 or 2 follicles. It is this way or that way. In IUI also you have less rate. In IVF also you don't have very great rate. In fact, we took out our data for 40 plus women and it was dismally low, ma'am, 5 to 10% with self-oocytes. So whatever the study says, it is for women with good reserve, and Western population, they usually don't lose reserve so fast. But we should understand that our women, after 40, they have very low reserve. So we can't promise them 13%, 15% also.
No.
My center, we can't, because they have low reserve and they usually make 1 or 2 follicles and,
Niti, you have opened the Pandora's box that everyone has to do ethical practice and you have to give the factual success rate.
Factual. This is what we do, ma'am.
Please
When they
don't
go
tell
for
them 80%, 90%.
yeah,
success rate.
when we are doing IVF with self-oocyte after 40, we have to tell them the success rate and plus about the risk of increased risk of chromosomal anomalies which comes at this age.
Very true. Very true.
Madam Rekha here. I would like to add 2 things here. One is, as Dr. Niti said, though AMH is more, we should tell her that that is not a golden figure, or you're not a very young lady. Take care of your, you should know about your ovarian aging, because the quality, once we put you on IVF also, you will not get good eggs. That is one thing. The second thing, you think of money, because she's really worried about the cost. That's what you're thinking. So you will be wasting on gonadotropin. They're not cheaper even for IUI. You will be coming somewhere around 20,000-25,000 when it is for around 10 days of gonadotropin. So keep the same money for next 3 cycles. If you try that IUI, the same thing, 1 cycle of IVF can be done, and probably we will have some eggs in hand.
Yeah. So very well, points are well taken. Now we have cleared this controversy as far as managing unexplained infertility in 40 plus cases, because all the evidence tells you that you should go ahead with IVF. Now this is the 5th dilemma. This is for Dr. Kalpana. Kalpana, she is 26-year-old, obese, BMI is 30, she has irregular cycles, male factor is normal. She has already undergone 4 cycles of IUI-H with oral ovulation somewhere. Now she has come to you and you have advised her gonadotropin cycle, but she wants to know about the laparoscopic ovarian drilling as well. So how evidence will meet experience in this case of LOD versus gonadotropins?
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. And first of all, I would like to express my thanks to Meena Samant, ma'am, and the organizers. Already, this weight is already a borderline weight for laparoscopic ovarian drilling, because in obese patients, we usually first go for weight reduction and lifestyle modification, and then we prefer to go for laparoscopic ovarian drilling or any other therapy. So we will not be discussing that thing. The dilemma is about laparoscopic ovarian drilling or gonadotropin. So first of all, I would like to counsel her about gonadotropin treatment. Gonadotropins, usually the conventional therapy is not good in PCOS patients. There we land up in very high risk of ovarian hyperstimulation. So in these patients, we should go for low dose regimes. There are 2 regimes. One is chronic low dose step up, and then one is step down protocol. So in low dose regimes, results in a monofollicular ovulation of approximately 70%, and pregnancy rate is of 20%. Multiple live births are 5.7%. And there is low incidence of multiple pregnancy if we go by these two protocols, either chronic step-up protocol or chronic or step-down protocol. Conventional dose should not be used in PCOS patients because here we have a very unacceptable high risk of multiple follicular development, and multiple pregnancies are as high as 36%, and there is pretty high chance of severe OHSs. So these are the important points. When we do, what are the points in laparoscopic ovarian drilling? Laparoscopic ovarian drilling, here I will be, it is a review of 17 studies and 1,664 cases, and it was found that the results are homogeneous. Spontaneous ovulation happens in approximately 60% of the cases, and there is 50% pregnancy rate, whatever techniques we are using, either diathermy or laser. Ideal is to go for 4 to 10 punctures. Many times people become so excited and they keep on going for drilling. That is quite devastating. So one should control. Only 4 to 10 punctures are sufficient. More punctures have been associated with premature ovarian failure. So this is one of the major drawback of ovarian drilling. Sometimes we may land up in premature ovarian failure. Then there are chances of adhesion formation also from 0% to 100%. And the risk of adhesion is higher when CO2 laser is used versus cauterization. And laparoscopy, ovarian drilling of 1 versus 2 ovaries, there are 2 randomized control studies of 40 cases, and it was found that there was no evidence of difference. It is a Cochrane review. So laparoscopic ovarian drilling can be done for 1 ovary or both. Results are similar. So now coming to the real controversy. So we'll be analyzing the benefit or the problems in terms of efficacy, safety, and cost of laparoscopic ovarian drilling or gonadotrophin. And whatever I'll be telling, it is from the Cochrane data 2010. It is a summary of 5 randomized control trials from 1998 to 2005. And in one group, there were 174 patients, and in other group, 165 patients. And these were the person who did the study. So far the efficacy is concerned. In case of LOD, we find that ovulation happens in 78% of the patients, while gonadotrophin gives a pretty high rate of ovulation, that is 90%. Pregnancy rate per cycle is 9% in LOD group, while it is 15% in gonadotrophin group. Miscarriage rate was 14% in LOD group, while 16% in gonadotrophin. And then live birth rate, 6 months follow-up, it was 15% in LOD group, and in gonadotrophin, it was a bit higher, 20%. Then live birth rate, 12 months follow and plus minus medications versus 6 FSH cycle, it was cumulative was 67%. Only LOD resulted in pregnancy in 34% of the patient. And in some patients, we had to give LOD plus clomiphene citrate, and then pregnancy happened, which was 49%, and LOD plus gonadotrophin, this resulted in 67%. So maximum was 67%. Then we had to add gonadotrophin along with the LOD. And here only gonadotrophin resulted in 60% of the pregnancies. Then live birth rate after 24 months plus oral medication, here the data was only of LOD, which was 82%. Now coming to the other concern, that is the safety and the cost. So in LOD, monofollicular development is more, 100% monofollicular. This is quite good. But in gonadotrophin, we have more chances of multiple pregnancies, and in 73% cases, gonadotrophin results in monofollicular development, monofollicular ovulation. Then multiple pregnancies are obviously more in gonadotrophin, and it is less. It is approximately 1% in LOD. The risk of OHSS is almost nil in LOD, while it is 3% in gonadotrophin therapy. Then risks related to surgery. Obviously, it is there in only in LOD group, not in the gonadotrophin group. Adhesion formations are also there, though chances are less, but it is there in LOD group. Premature ovarian failure risk is rare, but it can happen in LOD group. And it was in fact more common previously. Nowadays people are more aware. So they do lesser drilling, only 4 to 10 drillings. And again, the recommendations are there. So people are more careful while they are doing LOD. Then quality of life, there is no difference. So for the cost per term pregnancy is concerned, LOD happens to be cheaper as compared to gonadotrophin. Gonadotrophin therapy is a bit costlier than LOD. And the duration of beneficial effect, it is seen that the effect may last for years. While in a stimulation cycle, the benefits last till the stimulation lasts. So to summarize, I would like to say that the use of exogenous gonadotrophins is associated with increased chances of multiple pregnancy, and therefore intense monitoring of ovarian response is required. So most of the ART centers or whoever is doing this kind of therapy, they already have a good monitoring system. They already have an ultrasound machine or estradiol measurement system is already there. So this point can be easily taken care of. LOS alone is usually effective in less than 50% of women, and additional ovulation induction medication is required. So only 50% patients would be benefited by LOD, and in the rest, more than 50% of the patient, we will need gonadotrophin therapy or oral medication. Overall, ovulation induction is reported to be highly effective with a cumulative singleton pregnancy live birth rate of 72%. So far my patient and my opinion is concerned, I would like to counsel her more for gonadotrophin therapy, explaining that there is risk of adhesion formations, and there is a theoretical risk of ovarian failure as well. So I would like to try initially the gonadotrophin therapy.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us about the ISHRE guidelines 2018, where they have given you clear-cut guidelines, gonadotrophins versus LOD?
Basically, the message is the same. LOD is to be done in very carefully selected subpopulation, and as madam has pointed out, works out better in lean PCOS who are younger. Now, I think the Western situation is a little different from our situation, because often gonadotrophin treatment is subsidized, government pays for it. In our situation, the patient themselves have to pay for it. So I think here we have to make a little bit of compromise as per our experience. And our patients, usually they present young. They are not very, very obese, at least where I practice. So we still do drillings, not that frequent as we were doing earlier, but we still do.
Yeah. So here I just want to conclude by giving a take-home message on this case that LOD is not outdated. Our patients, they sometimes come from very long distances. It may not be feasible for them to come to you for frequent monitoring if you start gonadotrophins. And as Dr. Priya and Dr. Kalpana has said, gonadotrophins here in India is costly. So again, here it is a shared decision making between you and the patient, where you explain them both the pros and cons of LOD and gonadotrophins and let them choose, because the guidelines has given equal weightage to LOD and gonadotrophins in the ISHRE guidelines. So anyone wants to say anything? Manoj, you want to say something?
Ma'am, I too agree that chronic low dose gonadotrophin are equally effective, because laparoscopy has its own, I mean, it's not that cost effective. It has own, risk factors. So I would prefer chronic low dose gonadotropins and close monitoring to avoid OHSS. And
but in India, Manoj, there are various other factors also. Patient ka affordability, whether patient can come to you for frequent monitoring. So these are various other issues which you have to take into consideration. Yes, laparoscopy is an invasive procedure, but it has got its own advantages. If you combine it with hysteroscopy, it will take care of many other factors. And once you do LOD, the effect lasts for at least 6 months to 1 year, and they can try at home without coming to your hospital. So both pros and cons are there for both LOD and gonadotropins. Counsel your patient, take shared decision making, document it, take consent, and go ahead. So now let us come to the last dilemma for this panel discussion, and that is self-egg versus donor egg. And this is for Dr. Jyoti. Dr. Jyoti, we were discussing 42-year-old. She is trying to conceive since last 8 years. AMH is 0.7. AFC is 3 in the right ovary, 2 in the left ovary. Male factor is normal. You have advised her IVF with donor eggs, but she is very sensitive. She wants to use her own eggs. So how evidence will meet your experience? How will you counsel and go about it?
So ma'am, whenever we are dealing with cases, as we have already discussed in Dr. Priya's case, and she has briefed very nicely that above 40 years of age, when we are dealing, IVF is a better option. But the thing which we need to discuss with the patient is at an age of 42, wherein if we want to go for self-eggs, what are the challenges we face as a fertility consultant and what the challenges the patient has to get ready for. So increasing age causes decline in the ovarian reserve. It also decreases the oocyte quality. It increases the chance of aneuploidy rates and hence increased risk of miscarriage. And finally, the most important thing which we are doing IVF for is a live birth. And there is a decreased live birth rate with self-oocyte at the age of 42. So in such scenario, what are the options? So counseling, discussion of treatment plans is a very crucial role here. So the option is self-IVF versus donor IVF. So in case of when the patient is insisting for a self-oocyte, it needs to be explained to the patient that at her age, higher number of eggs are needed to form one euploid blast. Her AMH is low, so more number of cycle needed to form embryos, and that embryo has to be tested for euploid status. It means he'll have to undergo a PGTA. Increased cost to the patient because of the genetic test and more number of cycles. And eventually the success rate and the live birth rate will be low with the self-oocyte. There are a few studies to quote to the patient to explain the same. These almost 15,000 biopsies were done on the embryos, and it was found that 2 to 6% aneuploidies were found in women who aged between 26 to 37. And almost 33% was the aneuploidy rate at the age of 42, which increased drastically to 53% above the age of 44. This is a study wherein the Varela attorney found that the number of oocytes needed to form one euploid blast, wherein at the age of 37 and less, 5 to 6 oocyte can suffice are needed in order to form one euploid blast. When the reserve is less and you need 10 to 20 oocytes, means multiple cycles of IVF are needed in order to form one euploid blast. The miscarriage rate, this is a study report by the CDC 2012. It was shown that beyond 40 years of age, the rate of miscarriage with self-eggs is very high. And on the contrary, less than 38, the rate of miscarriage is less than 20%. This is a committee opinion for by ACOG, where it was found that in women, if self-oocytes were used during IVF, 12% women conceived. The live birth rate was 12% in 41 to 42 years of age. While if young donors were used, the live birth rate was 51% irrespective of the age of the recipient. This is a HEFA UK fertility statistics trend, wherein it was seen that the live birth rate, as age advanced and self-eggs were used, the live birth rate started declining, which is less than 10% beyond 40 years of age. In the same group, whatever is the age of the recipient, if the donor eggs were used, the live birth rate was beyond 25% in all age groups. So ma'am, to conclude this, like it is a very valid indication of donor oocyte as per the ASRM guidelines. Advanced maternal age, diminished ovarian reserve, women who had previous IVF cycles wherein the oocyte quality was poor or the embryo quality was poor, if a woman is a carrier of any genetic disease or she is a POF, premature ovarian failure, we can quote that these are the conditions where donor oocytes are helpful. Although in UK, the NICE guideline does say that women under 43 years of age should be offered one self-IVF cycle. Ma'am, but there it is government sponsored. The NHS is sponsoring it. In India, the patient has to shell from her pocket. And end of the day, what the patient is asking us is not doing one IVF cycle. She wants a healthy baby.
Yeah, very well said, Jyoti. Because NHS sponsors it, the big difference is that in India, patient has to pay from their own pocket. So I agree with you that in this case, donor egg is fully justified. If she insists, then you have to document that you offered a donor egg cycle, but she's insisting for self-egg. And then you have to take in writing that whatever problems you have discussed, including cycle cancellation, because if
absolutely
on the day of trigger, if we don't see any follicle, then what to do?
I think Jyoti has really brought it out, all the things very well. And I think all of us agree with her conclusion.
In our scenario, the donor IVF is only the best option. So thank you so much, all the esteemed experts. We have tried to give the answers, the evidence, as well as the experience on these 6 clinical dilemmas which we face daily in our practice. So thank you, Dr. Meena, for this opportunity. And I thank you and all the panelists for this wonderful panel discussion.
Thank you, ma'am.
Back to you. Yeah.
Thank you,
Meena.
ma'am. Thank you, Lakshmi ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
It was a wonderful panel, ma'am. Really, congratulations to all the experts here today.
सारे guidelines पढ़े.
सबने बिल्कुल. I mean, really, it was evidence and experience.
Evidence meets experience.
Yeah, and Lakshmi madam, the best part was selection of the cases.
Yeah.
All
I told them you all have to prepare, go through all the guidelines on your case and show the slides, and then we will discuss.
It's a day-to-day event that happens. So those kind of cases.
I also enjoyed moderating this panel.
A kind of unique presentation. It was a different theme altogether.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi ma'am, and all the esteemed panelists. This was such an exuberant and a thought-provoking case-based discussion. I would like to now invite our Dr. Professor Anupama Dave madam for the vote of thanks.
So good evening to all of you. Now we have come to the end of this wonderful webinar, Evidence Meets Experience, that too on fertility, which is in itself a novel concept. But here I would like to mention that we have lots of evidence, but at the end of the day, it is the experience, our experience and that of our colleagues, which helps us in making a decision. Basically, it has to be an individualized approach, and as Madam has rightly said, a shared decision-making is essential. I would like to thank all those who were involved and who participated, even our audience, for making this program a success. To be more specific, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Meena Samant, Chairperson CRC, for including this activity in West Zone and giving me the opportunity to coordinate this program. I thank all faculties, Dr. Asha Bakshi for her excellent talk, Dr. Neelam and Dr. Rekha Wadhwani for chairing that session. I thank Dr. Lakshmi Srikhande for moderating an excellent interactive panel with all updated evidence, and the cases selected really were too good. I thank the esteemed panelists who did a lot of hard work, Dr. Priya Bhave, Dr. Manoj Chelani, Dr. Niti Tiwari, Dr. Kalpana Singh, Dr. Rekha Rajendra Kumar, and Dr. Jyoti Tripathi. Then in the end, I would like to thank our Master of Ceremony, our efficient coordinators, Dr. Akanksha and Dr. Kanchan, and Dr. Deepika and whole team of Jackson Pal for making this program a success. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Just to bring this beautiful evening to an end, I have a quote: "Don't wish for the best alone, move ahead and grab the excellent." Thank you so much, everyone.
Ma'am, we'll take this opportunity. My teammate from Nari Division, sales team, He would just like to speak up.
Thank you, respected faculty and attendees. From Nari Division of Jackson Pal, I am Om Prakash Sharma, West Zone Sales Manager, seeking your support for ProRetro. Made in India ProRetro micronized dydrogesterone 10 mg tablet are assisting motherhood, delivering happiness. Doctor, we look forward to your presence in our further program in 22nd of October, 3 p.m. as always. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Faculty.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anupama ma'am, for this opportunity. Thank you, Lakshmi ma'am, for a wonderful panel. Thank you, everybody.